Hello there, and welcome to What's the Point? A question we should all be asking ourselves, and the podcast by brand architect Bill Ellis that will help you discover, clarify, and live your purpose.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to What's the Point? Another great episode with a guest that I'm really thrilled to have, Matt Whiat, the co-founder of Chapman Co. Welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. So I'm going to read some of what your accomplishments have been, and there are many.
Let's keep it short.
So Matt,
let's keep it short.
I'll keep it as short as I can, but I want to make sure people understand who you are. Matt's held roles in the United Nations to bring peace to Liberia, West Africa. He's working with NATO partners for operations in Afghanistan. He's been a boot camp squadron commander and service on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. Here you go. He's got graduate degrees in international relations, finance, and management from Troy University and the Air Force Institute of Technology. And he obtained his undergraduate degree in industrial engineering from Southern Illinois University. And all of that's great, and all of those are incredible accomplishments. But that's really just laid the groundwork for who you are, and that's what we want to get to on this show. We want to get to who you are, what's driven you to get where you are, and where you plan on going from here. Does that sound good?
That sounds like a conversation I would have with my parents, yes.
Okay, well, good. Well, speaking of your parents, that's just a perfect segue because I want to ask you, tell me about your parents. What'd your folks do?
Yeah, we'll start with my mother. She was a real estate agent in Orange County, California, and still is to this day. She does real estate on Balboa Island there in Newport Beach. My mom, my father was an airline pilot. So my mom pretty much raised us, to be honest with you. And so she was doing real estate and enjoying that, and came from a larger family, one of 6 kids. Her father was a kind of a business advisor to the Archdiocese in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills. And they grew up down south in Rancho Santa Fe. So that was my mom's side of the family down in San Diego. My father's side of the family was in downtown Los Angeles. So we lived right between the two of them. And my grandfather on my father's side, he was a mechanic. He used to deliver ice blocks in downtown LA.
Oh, wow.
So, you used to call it an ice block, and you would push these giant blocks of ice through the exterior wall to keep, dairy and other things you needed cold in your ice box. And while he was driving his Model T truck around, it would break down a lot, and he got good at fixing it. And then his friends, who were also ice delivery people, would ask him to fix their trucks. And he thought, why do I have to drive around delivering the product when the product can come to me? And so he became a mechanic. And so for his entire life, he ran a garage out of his house in downtown LA. And my father flew helicopters in Vietnam, came back, and started and flew in the airlines for his entire career.
Okay, well, there's a lot there. So I love how your grandfather shifted on the fly. He found out that what he was doing wasn't the best for him, and he shifted. It's also interesting for younger listeners and viewers to hear why they used to be called an icebox before it became a fridge or a refrigerator. It was literally an icebox. So that's great. And what I want to say is all of your accomplishments are fantastic, but what you have on your LinkedIn, I think, touched me more than everything you have in your list of accomplishments. And that's very simply where you say, I'm inspired to put people in the driver's seat so that passion and opportunity meet. And so simply put, to the listeners, Matt's just committed to adding value in all areas of life. I want to get to your military background because that's really laid the groundwork for who you are. You enlisted in the Air Force at the age of 18. Tell us about that. And what was your motivation? Why do you enlist and why the Air Force?
Crappy grades in high school. It's a little more true than anything. So I remember the graduation, night or the day you're supposed to graduate high school. I wasn't actually sure I even had enough credits to graduate. I can remember one of my first periods was research methods. I don't think I ever went to that class. I just surfed or screwed around or did whatever. And so I even I don't know why I'm sharing this with you and all the people who will listen to this. At times I'll literally wake up in the middle of the night being like, oh my gosh, I need to go to research methods. Never once. Couldn't even tell you who the teacher was. They never saw me. So I wasn't even sure I was going to graduate. When I told my dad, like I should, I think he should send me to San Jose State University or one of those that I could get into in California. He said, I'm not paying for your college. And I thought, well, damn, that ruined that growth plan. So I don't know. I didn't grow up in a military family or where I was in San Clemente and San Juan Capistrano, even though it's very close to one of the larger Marine Corps bases. We didn't have exposure to the military. I don't remember my father being in the military. I was too young. The 70s early 70s when he was in Vietnam. I think it just looked as an opportunity, one for education, for growth. Maybe there's a little bit part there that I wanted to serve. I'm not trying to be all altruistic here, like, oh, I was devoted to service. I was 18 and no clue where I should go, honestly.
Okay.
And so it's probably fast forward a lot of years. One of the reasons I wanted to be a boot camp commander was my experience in boot camp and what it was like and wanting to make it a little bit better. But honestly, my path into the military was one more of necessity than I want to go find my purpose in life.
Well, that's interesting because your short-term purpose was just to get to the next step, whatever the next step was. So that
I was working as a mechanic in. I forged my birth certificate so that I could work like when I was 14. So I was working as a mechanic to just have some money because we were upper middle class, but Dad wasn't giving anyone an allowance. So I was working already. And one thing I knew pretty quickly was, man, I don't need to get some book learning in me. I need some education here. So for me, it was I did want to further develop myself. That part was definitely part of it.
Well, that doesn't surprise me in the least, considering all of the accomplishments you've made. But so I want to get a sense for your entire military career. So I'm going to come back to this question that I've got. But obviously, with all of the accomplishments and your work with NATO and your work with the Joint Staff and a lot of the writing that you've done and a lot of the assignments you've had, you went from Basic Airman pretty high in the military. So there's a lot of story. There's a lot there to unpack. But I want to focus on one thing that I know is really significant, which I think ties your military career to where you are now in private practice. Yeah. And that was a flight back in June of 2011 when you were escorting a pretty well-known author, Simon Sinek, in and out of Afghanistan, and you were flying back to the States. Tell us about that episode, please, because it's pretty powerful and it has very far-reaching effects.
Yeah, sure. I was doing some leadership development work for one of a larger arm of the Air Force called Air Mobility Command. So the majority of our money, aircraft, fuel, spend, all those type of things flow through Mobility Command. So we run all the transport aircraft, aeromedical evacuation type of aircraft. And I was out at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois, and the four-star general, who I'm still good friends with, I'd worked with him in the Pentagon. And I was running a think tank, if you will, for lack of better terms. So I had some really smart folks. We were all working, doing a lot of leadership development and speech writing, testimonial kind of stuff, and a lot of different kind of programs the command was running. And he knew Simon Sinek, and Simon was writing a lot on leadership at the time and quoting the military. And so I think this general really looked at it as an opportunity for us to get closer to that author to tell all of the story. And so I took Simon into Afghanistan. And in general, it was, perfectly fine. It's a war zone, and so there are operations that are going on, and he's getting exposure to see some of those operations. We did an airdrop to a forward operating base, U.S. Army forward operating base. You got to see some aeromedical kind of activities and those type of things. And in general, pretty for that area, pretty standard kind of stuff that was going on. It was the time of the Navy SEALs lost two Chinook helicopters a big loss of life. And so it caused the entire area to kind of shut down. And so you get in and out of those kind of areas at the time with what's called opportune airlift. In other words, if you're just there coming to visit or look at things, you're a pretty low priority. So I was at the bottom, a priority rung with Simon. So if you fly an airline, think about the last group. That's what we are. And so when this happened with the Navy SEALs and we lost these 2 Chinook helicopters, it just gets a little bit, the logistics get very hectic. And so we're bumped. And so we have to stay there for a while. And there was one aircraft going out. It's called an HR mission, which stands for Human Remains. It was a Army sergeant or specialist was killed the day before. I didn't know him. His name was Specialist Jinsu Lee. And we were flying him back to the States, his body. And on those aircraft, the HR missions, you don't put anybody on there. And so this was just a special request to get us out. I had a colleague of mine that knew the air traffic controllers, and we kind of worked that. And so we flew him home on that aircraft. And Simon and I were talking a little bit about leadership and, I don't know, purpose and all of those kind of things you might imagine that happen when you're thinking about your own mortality as you're flying this young man home. And this is where he started writing his book, Leaders Eat Last. The title comes from Officers Eat Last. We worked with his publisher on that one. And that's where he started writing that book. When we got back, we decided to run a TED event, a public TED event hosted on a military base. So if you're looking around, Google TEDx Scott Air Force Base. See some great speakers. This is where David Marquet was one of our speakers who got his start. Bob Chapman, my CEO, was a guest there. And that's where his TED Talk comes from as well. And so after that TED Talk, and I was already doing this kind of work in the military, I decided to join Barry Waymiller, this parent company, we're capital goods manufacturing. And after about a year working there, myself and a couple other people within Barry Waymiller, we started the Chapman Co. Leadership Institute. And now we're externally facing, complete turnkey, full service consultancy that works with organizations from pro sports teams to airlines to just about everything in between.
Well, that took us from 2011 to 2021 pretty quickly, my friend. But so the impact, as I've heard and read about that flight with Simon Sinek was, first of all, you two were able to create a bit of a relationship, but just the sense and the impact of flying with that soldier who'd sacrificed his life. Getting back and seeing the impact of family and friends and other service people who did not know him, and the salutes and the tears and the impact of that, really, isn't that somewhat the catalyst that led you and Simon to talk about having a TED event?
Yeah, on the flight, just to dispel all of this, there's nothing. I have to be careful what I say here. It's just a tough situation when you are flying someone home and at the same time you know that in this case their spouse and 3 daughters will be told they're not coming home. Let's take away the politics of this. Let's take away the military, the war, all that kind of stuff. That's just terrible. That's horrific. These lives have been changed forever. Whether you believe in it, whether you don't believe in it, I don't care. That's terrible on an individual level. And we were sitting there on the floor by this flag draped casket, and Simon was talking about purpose and people in the military and what they have. And I told him the story of when I was in West Africa, and my job there was to stopping this civil war that was kind of on the tail end of. This is in 2003 and 2004 with Charles Taylor in Liberia as the dictator there. We were taking away a lot of the weapons and stopping these warring factions and trying to basically restart a nation, if you will. And I can remember being there, and we were coming in some helicopters, and this group had just been fighting, and we were landing and taking away some weapons and all this stuff, and we were looking at the wounded and what was going on. Like, we're just trying to figure out, what happened? How can we help with all these United Nation assets? And I look over, and there's this dude in just scrubs, and he's there checking from patient to patient, and I'm thinking, he wasn't wearing UN. He didn't have any kind of markings on him. I didn't recognize him as a military guy. I'm like, what is this guy doing over here? And I walked over, and he was a Belgian doctor serving Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, just out there as a volunteer. There's not a radio. I have all kinds of gear on. The U.S. Embassy knows where I am. I've got full communications. I'm like, that is bravery. That is service. And so we were having this conversation. We were talking about creating an event. In this case, it was a TED event. But how can we showcase people who serve others, regardless of what their field is? Perhaps they wear a uniform. Perhaps they're, I don't know, a first responder in the medical field. Perhaps they're an engineer. Perhaps they're a slam poet. Perhaps they're an author. Like, we brought all of these people, artists, just to talk about people who serve people. It's what inspires human beings anyway. So I think that was the catalyst of this. The outgrowth of that has been Chapman Co. We try and build and create leaders that do that in organizations. And a lot of times it's not about lecturing someone or mentioning how important it is. It's more allowing them to raise their level of consciousness so that they make more intentional behavior choices. It works on the premise that most of us actually show up trying to do a good job. And most of us want to get along and be a good person.
Yeah, so through that experience with Simon is how you met Bob Chapman, who's the CEO of Barry Waymiller. And for those of you unfamiliar with Barry Waymiller, that is a company name and not an individual. There's not a Barry running around.
No, if we get a call and they say, we'd like to talk to Mr. Waymiller, we know it's a sales call. I transfer them to the Clinton PD, Barry? Which they don't appreciate, but there you go.
So, the connection between Simon Sinek and Bob Chapman has a lot to do with the management philosophy that kind of evolved through Bob Chapman's growth as a leader of the company. And there's a whole story there about how he started to think of his business more from a perspective of them being family, because everyone's a member of some family. And those on YouTube, you can see right behind Matt's head there on the shelf is a book, Everybody Matters. So that philosophy really resonated with you, right? And that was a great connection between you and Bob Chapman.
Yeah, I think so. When I met Bob, and right, my product placement here is really working. So our publisher Good. Thanks you. All proceeds go to charity, by the way. So we're not making money off of a book here. Yeah, sure. I think to a standpoint, yes, that kind of philosophy helps. I think when I was making a decision I was just talking to another veteran who was leaving the military after a career, and I thought, I don't know if this is right for everyone, but when I was leaving the military, I really thought about, before I think about what job I want, I just want to think about what are my talents and where can I give the most is where I wanted to land. I figured if I could land in a place, no matter where I was on the level, like I wasn't being expected to say, well, you're at a senior level of leadership in the military, we'll give you a senior nod over here in the civilian world. I wasn't even expecting that. I was just thinking to myself, what's the place where I could land and apply my talents the best? Where can I give the most? And that really changed my perspective, I thought anyway, on what I wanted to do afterwards and how I ended up landing at Barry Waymiller. I think for Bob, we helped write this book. It's a little bit of a soft title, right? Everybody Matters. And when you mention the business as a family, I know some of the listeners are out there going, my family is a dumpster fire. Like, I don't know why you would want your company operating like family. Like, think of your family, large family get-togethers. How many of those go smoothly? There's no arguments. It's perfectly fine. Like, you run a company like you run your family, that's a disaster. I think the idea or the concept behind it is, do we care about the people that we're working with? Do they care about you? Are you included? Can you live out and develop your gifts and talents? That's the essence of it, the idea behind it. And so I don't want people to lose the idea of, it's one of those family kind of businesses. It's more from the standpoint of, I think for Bob, his inflection was, I have a lot of people that they spend their majority of their waking hours in a place that I kind of set the direction, the culture, how they're treated. Like, I have a lot of, not necessarily power, but a lot of opportunity to be really good in people's lives. And that's the essence of him. It's not that he's shaming businesses to say, you have a responsibility. It's more, hey, business, do you realize the opportunity that you have in addition to all the great charity and the work that you do in the community? What about the people that are in your span of care? And that appeals to me.
Yeah, and that's kind of what your LinkedIn quote references and your dedication to giving. So before we get too far from the military, let me ask you two things.
Yeah.
First of all, what's the greatest lesson you learned in the military beginning as a basic airman?
Tequila is a bad idea.
I can assure you that you don't have to be in the military to learn that lesson, but if that's where you learned it, that's where you learned it.
I'm just trying to really help my viewers out here. Like, I'm just letting you know. I know there's always a tequila connoisseur who goes, no, listen, you got to just spend some top shelf stuff. Okay, what was the question? I'm sorry. Lessons in the military.
Well, your greatest lesson both as a basic airman, but then I also want to contrast that with your greatest lesson as a senior officer in the military.
Well, I'm just going to go with my first gut answer. There's probably something, if I think about it later, I'm going to come up with something that's just genius because I'll hear someone else say it and I'll email it to you. But I'm going to go with my first gut answer. I was in basic kind of technical training. So we were doing work on how to work on airplanes. I was a mechanic in the Air Force as I was going to my undergrad. And I had this instructor, and he would walk us outside, and we're on the flight line, and we were basically taking a verbal test and answering these questions. And every time someone got a question wrong, they would have to run a lap around a B-52, which was a large bomber, and you would run nose to wing to tail to nose, and you do like 5 laps for every question you got wrong. And so all my friends were getting these questions wrong. And I think it came to me, and just luck would have it, I knew what the answer was, so I gave it to him. Now I'm the only one there, and the entire flight is running laps. And he says, you're gonna have to beep this one out. And he says, you know what, Matt? I'll bet they're calling me. And he started listing all of these bad words. Right? Like, oh, Matt, I'll bet they're calling me this, and they're calling me that, and they're calling me that. And the last word he said was, and they're calling me an asshole. And I stopped, and there's like this pause, and I said, no, Sergeant, I didn't hear him say asshole. And he thought that was so funny. And from that moment on, like, it was pretty much smooth sailing for me through the rest of the class. And so I think one thing I learned was never underestimate the power of humor if used correctly.
It's really important to add that clause if used correctly, and it sounds like it was very much there. And what about at a more senior level, when you were perhaps being called those names?
No, most definitely. And growing up from airman basic all the way to a senior officer rank, what I also realized was when someone in seniority would ask, do you have any questions? It was pretty rare that anyone in a lower ranking position would challenge or say something. I was usually the one that confused bravery and stupidity, and I would say something, which sometimes is appreciated and sometimes it wasn't. Yeah. So when I became a senior officer, I just really remembered it's very rare that as a senior leader, we truly are asking people closest to the work on the front line and literally listening to what their answers are or what their ideas are. And so from a senior officer level, I always thought to myself when I walked in, I'm probably the least experienced and knowledgeable about the work that's going on. And unless I really listen and watch and have some empathy and do the job, I'm going to lose that. So for what I would do as a senior officer is I would always ask in a new unit, I want to know what the worst job is, and I want to go do that. Because I want some empathy for what's going on the front lines to see what people are going through. I just figured I would make better decisions by understanding it and then asking a lot more questions.
Well, that's pretty powerful, and it makes a lot of sense in hindsight, my hindsight anyway, seeing how you segued into what at the time it was maybe the Barry Waymiller Leadership Institute, which evolved, if I'm not mistaken, into Chapman Co.
That's right.
And they were doing a lot of coursework. Wasn't the first course called Listen Like a Leader?
So we've had a lot of evolution of our business. When we first started this, it was Barry Waymiller. We call it the Barry Waymiller Leadership Institute. Originally, companies would say, hey, we've had a lot of success in doing your acquisitions. We're at 120 and counting right now in Barry Waymiller. And they said, well, how are you able to do that? And so we would bring them in and we present some information. They would leave probably inspired and confused. And so when we wrapped a business around this, we originally called it the Barry Waymiller Leadership Institute. Later, we renamed it Chapman Co. because Bob Chapman said, you will rename it after me. No, he didn't. He's a really nice guy. We actually commandeered a board. Commandeered a board meeting and surprised him with the name change. And his wife actually thought we were early retiring him, which I thought we should have just pulled it right there. So we renamed it after him. One of our first classes that Barry Waymiller University, this is an internal group inside of Barry Waymiller before I joined.
Okay.
They were running their foundational class for leadership was basically listening. Empathetic listening. How do I listen better as a human being, as an individual? That evolved into Listen Like a Leader. We now run several curriculum, and it's built inside of most of our programs. But listening is a huge aspect of leadership and people development. To include on the inclusion side, when we're doing DEI type of work all the way through senior leaders, we're embedding that listening component into it. And that's work that Barry Waymiller and the folks at Barry Waymiller University have been doing for years before I even joined.
So basically what you've done with Chapman Co. is to take that internal university concept and adapt it and bring it externally to other businesses, yes?
Yeah, I've specifically named an institute. So, because I think, one of the pitfalls that organizations are trying to avoid is if you've started an internal university, how does it continue to grow and get better? And so with us working on the outside, we're constantly feeding information to the inside. So an institute as in, let's stay humble enough to know that we can learn from anyone in any situation and evolve the content on the inside, how that works, with the best of what's happening in other organizations.
Okay. So with listening at the heart of at least the start and the heart of everything we've talked about, one of your quotes and focusing on leadership, you talk about leadership as treating people like family and honoring the role of the leader as a responsibility to give more, care more, and sacrifice more rather than an opportunity to get more. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's interesting in our organizations that almost how we treat leaders at times can fight against that mentality. So as an example, in the military, it'd be no different than perhaps in civilian society right now, where the more senior I am in an organization, the more perks I might have. Might have a car, might have my parking space, might have my own office, might have my own executive assistant. I might have, for the military, it was very similar to that. It literally fights against, hold on, did you remember, though, that as I give you all these things, I'm not giving them to you, I'm giving them to the position so that you can serve your people better. Those are perks, those are niceties, but at times it fights against that. Even our organizational charts are structured to where I have someone at the top, and then I have someone below me visually. And then we say things like, I want to bring it down to the lowest level, as if these people that are in my span of care are lower life forms. They're not. And we were doing this activity at one point with a senior team, and I think it was the CEO even said this. We were talking about the org chart, and he says, what's interesting is, the higher up in the org chart I get, if those people don't show up for work, we're fine. The lower I look at my org chart, if those people don't show up for work, we're in trouble. Who's really important here? And I'm not trying to say that there's not importance. I just mean from a leadership standpoint, being promoted is you have an obligation now to serve more. And I don't think anyone ever says, congratulations on your promotion. I got to tell you, leadership at times is going to suck. It's hard. It's messy. You're not always going to have the right answers. The job is more difficult. We make a big deal like it's a promotion. Here's your new pay. Here's your new office. And we don't say, this is going to come with some hard knocks at times. It's going to be tough. And you'll know you're doing it right when you're asking others for help.
Yeah, so how do you give me an example of how you, with your client companies or internally, either way, how do you go about teaching leadership or enhancing leadership? What's your approach on that?
Yeah, it takes a couple of different varieties on this one. A typical way that we would work with an organization would be, before I'm going to pitch a product or services, we're probably going to do one of two kind of assessment kind of deals. And so one is, am I running, we have our own organizational culture assessment that we built because we wanted to show, I want to see how people orient to the goals, the purpose. I also want to see how people are behaving to each other. That's the people aspect. But I also want to understand how the work is structured. Like, how have you set up the work in a way that's not frustrating to a human being? So we run that analytics survey because I want to get some information. I basically need to turn your culture into math. You're in the C-suite, we're talking that language, great. I'm going to give you objectively as I can, here's information. Here's what we should work on. Here's some gaps. From an individual standpoint, then, I'm also mapping this back to say, in an organization, from the time that you're, let's call it an intern, to all the way to you're a CEO, I want to know all the touch points of development. From onboarding letter all the way to succession planning, let's talk about how your organization develops people. I know it's a roundabout way to get to your answer, but before I'm just going to sit someone into an experience or a business simulation, I want to know what you already have, what you're doing, what's working well, and where we can plug in to make it better. So assessing is the first step, which is a structured way of listening to the client.
So a form of discovery and learning. And I'm going to put in the show notes a link to your TEDx talk at St. Louis University. But in that talk, you revealed that you did some early research that you learned quite a bit from a questionnaire that you sent via email to your wife.
To a family member.
How'd that work?
I just thought about, in general, surveys are surveys that you ask people. First of all, if you're not going to do anything about it, don't run the survey. Don't look for a score. Mm-hmm. The whole purpose is to have this. But there's also sometimes a survey can come across as very almost clinical, if you will. Like there's no humanity in it. Like I'm inputting my feelings, my open-ended comments into this computer system, and then I don't know what happens to it. So typically what we'll do to kind of humanize the process is after I'm running an engagement survey, now we're doing focus groups. Not only on where we need to do some work, like, this department or this group of people or this organization, this area needs some help, but I'm also going to where it's scored high. What's going right here? Why is it not going as well over here? Like I want to humanize that and listen to individuals. So we do a lot of focus groups or focus groups training to get into that a little bit.
Okay, so you've definitely dodged the episode where you sent that research request to survey to the wife.
The concept though is still is strong, right? So think about if you're your spouse or your children, think about sending them a survey and then you getting the responses, but then never having a discussion about it afterwards. That's the premise behind here. Also, I just want to throw out, I have an idea that we bring a senior leader team. I want you to think, listeners here, I want you to think about your own senior leader team. And I have this idea, like I bring senior leader teams together, and then for leadership development, I put shock collars on them, like pets. And then I control the shock collar. And then I just zap people when they say dumb things. And I know right now people are going, can I buy that from you?
Yeah. You could market that, and that might be $1 million idea. So speaking of people looking up to senior management, the philosophy so succinctly titled "Everybody Matters," which is much more in depth than, as you said, the title might suggest, is a concept based on all the way throughout an organization. People appreciating people for being exactly that, people. Not necessarily a dysfunctional family, but respect and listening and that type of behavior. What happens, what do you do in an organization, Matt, where it's pretty clear that at some point down the chain, people get real good at talking the talk and real poor at walking the walk, in particular when their personal agenda, when they're looking for what I can get if I get promoted, that car you talked about, that parking spot, and all of a sudden they can kind of dance around the philosophy. What happens then? How do you address that?
Yeah, this is good media training for me, right? Like I'm going to take your question, I'm going to move it to a question I want to answer, and then I'm going to ask it to myself. Yes, but let me take it from a different aspect. Rather than the person trying to get something for the promotion, let's just say we have this culture and it's all great and everything. And yeah, that's perfectly fine. What do you do about the people, though, that don't exactly behave in the way you want them to behave? Perhaps their intent is they want to get ahead. Perhaps is they just don't know how to do it, whatever it might be. But it's basically like, that's all nice. But what are you doing about the people who are either trying to circumvent, use the culture to the advantage, get promoted at the expense of other people? I think one is oftentimes, in general, in our organizations, we go right after the behaviors. And then we personally assign motives to those behaviors. And sometimes what's missing is, how has the organization incentivized someone? So as an example, I'll see a complaint would be, we're very stovepiped, right? We have our silos that operate and they don't collaborate very well. Our leaders need to be more collaborative. But then when you get in the organization, you realize, yes, but you've set up an incentive structure that there's no reason for them to collaborate. You've literally made them into competition. They're trying to outdo one another for a bonus. So we can talk about their behavior all we want, but actually it's you that's the problem. We have to restructure this if you want that to happen. Right? So one aspect of this is, can we look at the systems that we've put people in and how we're trying to incentivize them one way or another? Right? So that's probably one aspect. The other one, I'll make this a little more personal, and this would be like, well, what about people that just, I don't know, they're off the path or they're not adhering to your values, whatever this might be. Like, let's just call it the problem child. Well, one is, are you doing everything you can to give them the help they need? And that's, I know it's conceptual and broad-based, but just asking yourself that question, what have we done or not done to help this situation, this person? The other part, and I'll just tell a very fast story here. I was in command, and we had a person, a young member of the military that was doing some things. She got in trouble for that. It was a performance improvement plan was put into place. A lot of time and energy went to bring this person back on the, let's just call it normative kind of behaviors for this organization. And then it was found out that this person had done some other things, and it was even worse. So this person was going to be kicked out of the military. And probably beforehand, there were going to be charges. There might even be perhaps even something even more serious, maybe even jail time. And I can remember being so upset about this, about how hard we had tried, and didn't they know how much work we had put in, and how could they do this to us? It was all about me and the unit and all the time we spent. And I had a gentleman that I was working with, a colleague. I'll never forget, he said, you can give up on this person as a member of the U.S. military, but you should never give up on that person as a human being. And that changed how I thought about it, how I reacted, how I talked to him. Now, the end result was the same, but finding out all the things that had gone on in that person's life allowed us to react in a much more humane manner, and they needed some help. And we wouldn't have gotten them that help if that person hadn't have said that phrase to me. And so I think for anyone who's listening out there, if we're having to make some tough decisions in terms of our people, do we just not forget about them as a human being? The decision might still be the same, but treat them with dignity and respect. And that's the premise of Everybody Matters. It's not that everybody gets whatever they want. It's not that everybody gets to do whatever they want. It's that everyone at least gets treated as a human being.
That might be as strong a statement of what Everybody Matters represents that I've heard. So thank you for that. You have talked in the past a lot about the importance of feedback, and I know that comes certainly from your military background. I believe you know Cujo Teschner. Sure. He talks about his book, Debrief to Win, and he was a guest on the show earlier. Feedback, how do you give it? How do you receive it as a leader? How do you receive feedback? Yeah,
we'll go through this a little quickly, but I know for a lot of us, we've probably been told, well, feedback is a gift, which, okay, if it's valuable. If it's not, it's like the gift maybe you get from an in-law. Like, I don't know that I need another pair of socks, but we're calling it a gift. The first gift of feedback is actually asking for it. Brain science will show that literally asking for someone's opinion, asking for their input, asking for their feedback is the same areas in the mind are stimulated as the same areas that are responsible for receiving a reward. Words of affirmation, could be pay, whatever. Like literally asking someone their opinion is the true gift. It's also the number one thing people will ask for in inclusion type of training. Like, what did a person or group do to make you feel included? Ask my opinion, made eye contact, ask me for feedback. So first step in feedback, strangely enough, ask for it. Ask for it a lot. It displays that you care. It displays that you care enough to listen to someone. And if you're someone that's more highly expressive like I am, asking for the feedback defaults you into a more listening mode. You're curious about what the job is or people, ask for the feedback. That's the first part. The second part, when you're giving the feedback, be as specific as possible with what the situation was. How does it occur? Definitely mention what the impact is. But the most important part, and the place where I see feedback go off the rails and turn into a cul-de-sac of country music tears, is we confuse judgment with behavior. If you're going to call someone lazy, that is a complete judgment. And I'm not saying the person isn't lazy, but if I literally want the person to receive my feedback and change their behavior, I can't have them putting up walls. And if I call them lazy, rude, don't care about your work, all of these are very, very big judgments. And we can debate that back and forth. But if someone were to ask you, well, before you call them lazy, what's the thing that they're doing? They might say, well, they're not putting their TPS cover sheets on their reports. Okay, that's the behavior. We're going to focus on that. Give feedback on that. Don't give feedback that they're not engaged, that they're not a team player. That's all perspective based. And that's where I see feedback really going off the rails.
Yeah, and a couple of things, if I may. Behavior versus judgment. Behavior, it can be seen or heard or felt. Judgment is subjective. So if you see someone leaning against the counter, they're leaning against the counter. You might say they're lazy. You might say they're taking a break. You might say any number of things, but the behavior is very simply they're leaning against the counter.
Right.
So that's always been a good reminder for me to avoid judgment, which I think all of us can fall into. I certainly know I have. The second thing I just want to make sure everyone listening understands, because you've talked about it earlier, but the first step is asking for feedback. And going back to when we talked about surveys, a real key element to that, and Matt, I know you'll agree with this, is being willing to do something with it. Whether it makes sense, whether it's actionable feedback or whether it's sensible feedback, being able to receive it and acknowledge it.
Yeah.
So that the worst thing is you always ask me my opinion and then I never hear anything back from you.
Yeah, and that's the reason why if we're working with a client, and I'm mentioning this not as a pitch for Chapman Co, but if you're running an engagement survey, giving your leaders some type of training on how to receive the feedback, because it's not just the senior most people in the organization. It's so go your frontline leaders, so goes your culture, so goes your customer experience. So I need to get the frontline leaders to say this survey has just gone out. Here's how we're going to respond to it. Here's a way that responds in a way that we're not making excuses, we're not giving context, we're just gathering more information and trying to find ways to make it better. But giving some training, and especially on the listening and receiving feedback and asking for feedback side, is critical for us when we're deploying a survey to a client organization. And regardless of the survey you're running, whether it's best places to work or something really robust like the McKinsey Org Health Index, giving your leadership some training on how to receive that is really critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you for that. So, by the way, if anyone's listening and thinks, boy, Chapman & Co. could help my business, I don't think you're promoting it, but if there's an opportunity presented and people become aware that there's a solution through this, that's fantastic. And just one more reason I'm glad I do this podcast. I want to respect your time, and I've got two more things to ask you, and I'll shoot them at you, and hopefully we'll get it in under the wire. The first is the last almost 2 years now has been stress-filled, crisis-filled, unusual in business in all aspects. Obviously, I'm talking about the impact of the pandemic and everything that's had to do. So there's a lot to learn about leadership in the midst of crisis. But rather than get to that, let me ask you this. What has been the most surprising thing that you've learned as a result of seeing this last year and a half, 2 years? And what has that pushed you to do, either within Chapman & Co. or you as an individual, Matt?
As an individual, I've learned, man, I am a terrible parent. Like my kids, they are unruly. I can't be around them. Like that's not on them. That's on me. So one thing I learned was I need to be a better parent, probably spend more time. From a personal standpoint, I'd almost say, yeah, that's totally true. Like my relationship, I have two young boys, 10 and 12. And so for them, a relationship, because of the pandemic and working from home more, I mean, just much closer to them. At one point, they're like, Dad, do you cuss on all your calls? I'm like, oh, you're right, boys. I need to clean up my language on Zoom. So I mean, that's one aspect that I think we've learned from a professional standpoint, in professional sense. And I'm a little bit on a soapbox here, so I'm twisting this to say, and what can organizations do about it? The number one thing I would say for organizations, for leaders, for teams, take the dial of recognition and turn it to 11. Just keep telling your people how much you appreciate how hard they are working, separate of whether we've achieved something, we've innovated something, separate of metrics, even before we get into all those, which I think you should recognize. Recognize people for the effort they're putting in and for how they are behaving, whether it's how collaborative they are, what a great team player they are, how they asked for feedback. Recognize that stuff and recognize the effort people are putting into this stuff. I think we do this instinctively now. I think when we're going out to some small businesses that we want to support, when we decide we're tipping extra because of how difficult jobs are, we should be doing that inside our organizations as well. That's my pop culture reference for you. So if you haven't seen Spinal Tap, turn it up to 11. It's why Tesla, when you turn it up, the volume in a Tesla goes to 11. This is all free with the podcast, people. It's all free.
Well, interesting answer. But so, what are your thoughts on the employment situation where it seems as though a good percentage of people have realized, I don't want to return to what I was doing, and does that surprise you? And what kind of insight can you give employers of any size organization to perhaps stem that?
Can you give me the question again? Was this from a more work from home kind of mentality, or what are we talking about?
No, just in general. I mean, what I'm seeing and reading is that there is a high percentage of people who have decided at all levels of work that they don't want to do what they have been doing. So it's very apparent in the retail service business, restaurants, wait staff, but also through companies where people do want to work from home, or they've realized, I didn't like what I was doing, I want to look at something different. Does that surprise you, and what kind of action do you suggest companies might take?
This is a several faceted kind of question and an answer here, because it's a pretty complex subject. I would just offer from a conceptual standpoint, what happened with work from home, it's not necessarily just the freedom. It wasn't just necessarily I get to have my own schedule. It's the autonomy. Like, I get to decide when I'm taking a break. I get to decide what phone calls I'm making. I get to decide what I'm wearing. There's just a lot more autonomy, and people love choice. They love autonomy. And so as I went back from home and I don't have someone looking over me, or I'm not having to adhere to the norms of perhaps the office, and that autonomy is super, super interesting. And I find huge value in it, to the point where I'm willing to take a different job at perhaps not even the same pay. And so I think one thing that organizations are faced with right now is, what's my value proposition? What should the office be used for? How much autonomy can I continue to give people if I want to keep the best talent? Whether we like it or not, those are now table stakes. Like, this is the kind of organization. And just to say this a little self-servingly, it's great for our business, because now we're not just working with organizations who say, I think it's a nice thing or a good thing to do. It'll help our business, sure, but I just want to be good to people. Now it's becoming, as employees, it's almost like, if you want me to come work for there, talk to me about your culture. Talk to me about work from home policies. Talk to me about how much choice I have. Talk to me about growth opportunities. That's the employer of the future. And we can debate whether that's good or bad or right or wrong. But if you're going to attract, recruit, onboard, and retain the best talent, that's the kind of organization you're going to be building.
Okay. Yeah, very complex, and I appreciate your top line response there. So this podcast, as you are perhaps aware, called "What's the Point" for a reason. It's intended through story and through the example of others to help all of us discover or clarify and live our purpose. You've had a very successful life through your military career. You're certainly doing great things now in the public sector. So if you look at everything you've done and you try to put that in the context of purpose, purpose evolves over time. I guess let me just get straight to the point, and that is to ask you the question, what's the point of everything you've done and purpose and where you're going? What's the point?
Well, I think such a deep question to end with, right? We should have started with this one. I'm going to tell this through a different story, not just my aspect of this, but we were interviewing a senior team. This happens to be for a very large airline, and this was the basically the COO of running one of the world's largest airlines. And we were asking him kind of the same thing, like, why are you doing this? What's the point? Is it running an airline? Is it shareholder value, et cetera, et cetera? And I thought his answer was the best, and it's really stuck with me. He said, I don't know, because all I'm trying to do is run a really good lap. And then when I'm done with the lap, I want to hand the baton off to someone else that put us in advantage so they can run a great lap. Because I've enjoyed running. And I thought, oh, it's a very simplistic way of looking at this. But can I just leave the place a little better? And not only leave it a little better, but then when I let it go, that someone else takes it to a different level that I never would have imagined. And so for me, I look at that aspect of, am I showing up and serving a different group of people, a different individual, and whether that's through mentoring or learning or whatever it might be, the people aspect I've always gravitated to. And whatever else we're doing in the organization, that's just the medium so that as people we can work and serve each other better.
Well, Matt Whiat, co-founder of Chapman Co. All contact information for Matt will be in the show notes. But I do want to thank you so much for your time. I know what a busy schedule you run. I appreciate that. I appreciate your insights. I appreciate maybe from your son's input, limiting some of your cursing. Although I gave you a green light earlier. But thank you so much for your time. I appreciate everything you've offered, and I appreciate
Thanks,
you.
Bill. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We can promise you'll gain value in every one. Rating and reviewing makes us more discoverable and helps others find out what's the point. And if you'd like to know more about Bill Ellis or contact him, please visit his website, www.brandingpillars.com. See you next time.